Hello and welcome back to FatbossTV. Today we're back from the very first raid test on the battle for Azeroth Alpha within Uldir, and we're looking at Zek'voz, Herald of N'Zoth.
Yes, this Garalon lookalike is set to be the fourth boss in the instance according to the ever-shifting dungeon journal. It is a 3-phase encounter with a short intro phase at the beginning where you get to work out the boss's base abilities that he'll be casting throughout the fight, kind of similar to how Star Augur works in the Nighthold. So let's kick it off and look at the boss's base abilities.
So for the tanks, he will cast Might of the Void, which is a 3-attack ability. He'll start off with a short-range frontal cone called Void Lash. This deals a burst of shadow damage and applies a 50% healing reduction to anyone that gets hit, and this lasts 8 seconds. Afterwards, he'll cast Shatter, which deals a burst of physical damage to the tank and applies a 50% physical damage taken debuff for 40 seconds, and then finally he'll finish the sequence off with yet another Void Lash frontal cone. There are lots of ways you can set up who takes what hits during these casts. We decided that just having one tank take the entire combo worked best, at which point the other tank can just taunt off them. As long as the tank taking the hits used his cooldowns correctly, he would survive the hits with a decent amount of HP, meaning he wouldn't die to the 2 stacks of Void Lash, which at this point is reducing his healing taking by 100%. If this ability hurts way more on live, you'll probably want the first tank to take the first 2 hits, and the second tank taking the last Void Lash hit. Moving on to a more exciting ability is Surging Darkness. Each time Zek'voz reaches 100% energy, he'll mark the location of the tank, and this location acts as the epicenter of a series of 3 explosions that the raid needs to dodge. Each explosion is different, and the order each time is also random. One of the explosions has a central patch with a large ring around it. For this one, you just need to stand in the gap that's been generated between the 2 effects. Another is very similar, except this time the central patch is much larger, and as a result there is no gap to stand in. For this one, you just need to move all the way out of both of them. And the last one is just a large ring area, but with a completely clear center. For this one, you just move into the center, and that way you avoid everything. If you do stand within the dark eruptions, you will take lethal damage, but on top of this, each time an explosion does go off, the raid does take a chunk of damage, so healers need to make sure that everyone is healthy over the duration of the 3 Surging Darkness explosions. For the first few pulls, we actually dodged around the zones as is probably intended. However, we did end up just dragging the boss into a completely new corner of the room just to spawn the epicenter of the zones far away from the rest of the raid. And as soon as the ability went off, we would just drag the boss far from that area so nobody needed to even dodge them. This isn't a particularly nice strategy to your melee, we found out, especially those with bad movement options, but it does pretty much remove any sort of personal responsibility that the ability would otherwise require to dodge. Also, this does allow you to stack up and remain within healing AoE effects on the ground, which helps your healers counteract the unavoidable part of the damage. Now, Zek'voz's last ability is Titan Spark. The Titan discs on the outside of the room begin to spin and just start dealing bursts of damage to random players in the raid throughout the fight. This ability just gives your healers more things to do during what would otherwise be downtime. Once you get Zek'voz to around 90% health, his first phase will begin.
During this phase, Karaji warrior adds will spawn in groups of 3 in 2 set locations in the room. These guys will each fixate a player and chase them down, and if they do reach that player, they will apply a nasty stackable dot which also slows them by 50%, and after this they'll just refixate on another random player. So you need to control and nuke down these adds as soon as possible. They do have a fair amount of health and they do come in pretty frequently, so you must make sure you keep on top of them. All forms of crowd control do work, including hard crowd control such as blinds. However, this crowd control does seem to get diminishing returns on them over time, so that means you can only control these adds for so long. We found that using impactful CC was super important, such as using mass scripts into AoE stuns and roots. That was really solid at helping grouping these adds up while nuking them down. To maximize boss damage during this time, we also tank the boss right on top of the adds, even while they're moving around. Tanks just need to make sure that they don't hit anyone with the Might of the Void combo, as well as keeping an eye on the boss's energy to make sure that you can move them out for the Surging Darkness circles. The only other ability during phase 1 is an eye beam. A giant Cthulhu style eye will appear at the front of the room and start selecting random non-tank targets. He will then hit them with an eye beam that deals a large burst of damage to them, but this beam will attempt to chain lightning bounce to anyone nearby, and if it does jump, the damage is increased further. After he's cast this a few times, the eye beam will then despawn for a while before coming back later. So you need players selected by the ability to move away from anyone else, and we found it as roughly around 7 to 10 yards, it isn't actually specified. As this was alpha testing and there was a fair amount of lag, we just decided to have the entire raid spread whilst the eye was active and attacking people, and then would stack back up afterwards. Now this eye beam can target melee, which feels really quite cruel actually. Melee either need to be super quick at reacting to one another, or they just need to be spread out just like the ranged are, just to make sure nobody gets hit. Now, these casts can happen during a surging darkness, meaning that the raid damage is going to be really high at this point, so these seem to be the best times to be using large healing cooldowns. But aside from that, as long as you keep CCing and killing the ads whilst not letting the I-beam chain lightning the entire raid, once the boss gets to around 65% health, he'll transition into Phase 2.
Now Phase 2 is arguably easier than Phase 1 as long as you have a larger raid size. The I-beam and the bugs from Phase 1 will no longer spawn, and instead you'll have to deal with 2 new abilities. 3 Anubar Voidweaver ads will spawn in a triangle formation in the middle of the room. These ads will each spam cast Void Bolt, which deals a nasty burst of damage to a single player. You need to assign interrupts to each of these ads, needing roughly 2 melee and 1 ranged interrupt per ad to keep cover of all the casts. Although the ads cannot be physically moved, they can be stunned and silenced, which will definitely help you out with your rotation. When interrupting the cast, we found that you need to make sure that you interrupt towards the end of the cast, as the ads aren't actually locked out when they're interrupted, meaning they'll immediately start casting again after the interrupt. Just like the ads in Phase 1, we also found like tanking the boss on one of the ads also helped keep the boss damage reasonable, whilst everyone focused down the 3 ads. The other ability in this phase is Roiling Deceit. This is a long dot placed on a couple of players, which leaves a pool on the ground when it expires. If a player runs into one of these pools, they'll spawn a Guardian of Yogg-Saron ad. This ad doesn't have too much health, so if you do accidentally spawn one, you can definitely kill it. However, these ads are deadly, as when they're around for too long, or whenever you kill them off, they'll explode in a Shadow Nova, dealing near lethal damage to the entire group. So to stop the ads from spawning, ideally you'll want to drop these pools of goo far from the rest of the raid, so no one accidentally runs into them. When you get the boss to around 50% health, Phase 3 will begin, or at least it should. The boss just kept doing Phase 2 abilities until we got him to around 45% health, at which point we wiped, so although we didn't get to see the last phase, we can definitely talk about it briefly.
So yeah, alongside increased incoming raid damage from the Titan Spark, which is just going nuts now, the only other ability is Corruption Orb, and the dungeon journal entry for this is a little bit vague, so I'm just going to kind of give you my interpretation. So the orb is going to be falling from the sky, and if it lands on the ground, it'll do ever-increasing damage to the raid, which is probably going to wipe you, so instead, somebody needs to intercept it. When you do intercept it, so it lands on your head, either the orb will despawn or it will be launched back up in the air. It says it gets launched forward, which makes no sense, but either way, when you do soak it, you're going to get a really cool debuff on you called Corruptor's Pact. This debuff increases your health and your damage and healing done by 100%. However, when this debuff times out, you will become mind controlled. Whilst mind controlled, you'll be periodically fearing players within 8 yards, and you'll also have an interruptible fear cast, and this mind control lasts until you die.
So it seems like you'll want to have your DPS take turns at intercepting the orbs while you simply just nuke down the boss. And when people start to get mind controlled, you'll either have to just kill them off, or perhaps you can crowd control them. We don't actually know. Or perhaps you can just completely ignore them and just nuke the boss and hope that he dies before the mind controls become too much of an issue. It is a shame we didn't get to see this phase. However, this is the very first test on Alpha. Many people don't even have access to the Alpha right now. So it's very likely this boss will be retested. And when it is, of course, we will take a look at it. And if we think it's worth making another video for it, we definitely will. But that's the boss. What are our thoughts?
So yeah, there did seem to be some tuning problems, which is really expected on a first boss on
especially
Alpha
in
testing,
a smaller raid size.
Especially when we did have our smaller raid size. So the damage from the Titan Spark, the constant ticking damage to the raid, did feel pretty high. It was kind of hard to counteract it. But what was harder to counteract, and what we spent the majority of our time kind of working out and getting down, was the ads in Phase 1. They definitely felt overtuned. They had a lot of HP, and pretty much the entire raid had to go an AoE build just to make sure they died in time. And because they took so long to die as well, the amount of CC you needed to use on them was pretty crazy. Considering it's only a heroic boss, you were using like CC combinations that you'd expect to use on something like Mythic Agrimar.
Yeah.
It was like you had to use so much stuff like in a long chain. So it definitely felt like they was around for a little bit too long. Those ads in Phase 1 also had a really weird habit of fixating a player in melee, and like all of them would fixate one player and just hit them at once, giving them 6 stacks immediately. Primarily tanks. So I'm not sure what it is. Like, it seemed like if they're CC'd, maybe they like generate threat on a particular target and then they will all go onto that target. But it definitely feels like if that is the case, you might be able to exploit it by stunning the ads, getting a tank to generate threat, and then just kiting them around forever. And if it isn't intended, then it definitely needs to be fixed, because it's really annoying as a tank trying to help out on AoEing them, and all you do is get 6 stacks and nearly die to it. So hopefully they figure that stuff out.
And also the fixate wasn't just going on tanks, we should probably point that out. It was also going on healers.
Yep.
It was going on some DPS. Just suddenly, all of them would go for one target.
Yeah,
which just seems very strange.
Especially if you're melee and you're in there trying to do good damage, and then it's like, oh, now I'm dead. So it feels even more melee unfriendly, especially if you're doing the runaway with the Surging Darkness strat.
And as mentioned before, the boss wasn't actually transitioning at the health percentage listed in the Dungeon Journal, which is probably just the Dungeon Journal maybe being slightly out of date, but all the alpha stuff which you would expect to be there in the first place. The boss itself, I think, had pretty good pacing. The abilities look nice, even though the Surging Darkness did have a slight graphical issue. If you had your camera at a certain angle, you couldn't physically see it, which means we did have some people just randomly die to that because they couldn't see it.
Also, the middle graphic on the Surging Darkness, like when it's in the dead center, is really hard to see in comparison to like the 2 outer rings that you have.
Yeah, it doesn't really have a distinct outline.
Yeah, whereas the other ones do. So it's kind of, it feels like all of them should be either one way or the other, rather than it just being a weird mix. But yeah, apart from like all the, as you said, alpha style issues, I really like the prison theme of this instance. It's really cool. The boss is fun to play against, although it felt really, really difficult. But yeah, I can't wait to test this guy again when everyone's a bit more used to the stuff in BFA and, you know, the boss is probably tuned a little bit better, as well as seeing the rest of this instance.
For sure.
It feels very Uldir-y, which is pretty cool.
But thank you very much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this little preview, then do drop us down a like. There will definitely be more coming as soon as they're available on the alpha. And a huge thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You guys are absolutely fantastic. If you like our work here, then do go check out our Patreon page. A link for that can be found in the description. And thank you for watching, and we shall see you all in the next video.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.